"Please don't take our food, we saved all day for this," said the little boy to the lonely rich rancher. Late winter, 1889, Morgan Ranch, Wyoming Territory. Snow drifted across the wide plains in gray sheets, coating the barbed wire fences and piling knee-deep against the posts. A bitter wind ripped through the trees clinging to the ridge, carrying chill that cut to the bone. Near the mess hall of Morgan Ranch, a handful of cowboys leaned close to a barrel fire, arms outstretched to catch just a flicker of warmth. Flames danced in their faces, masks against freezing air. Silas Morgan rode slowly through the swirling snow, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. His coat was heavy and stiff, dusted with frost, his hat brim pulled low over eyes gray as winter sky. He was 38, and the hardship of many seasons etched into every line of his face. He dismounted near the stable, reins in one hand, the other hand slipping into his pocket to straighten the worn leather of his gloves. The cold gnawed at his boots as he stepped onto packed snow. A flicker of movement near the back of the mess hall caught his eye, behind the barrels and the crates where kitchen scraps were thrown away. He paused, noticing 4 children huddled against a sagging wood bin cracked by cold and age. They moved silently, heads low, searching the snow as though it might yield something warm to eat. The eldest, a boy about 5 years old, stood at the front. His name was Eli. He was gaunt, limbs thin, cheeks red raw from windburn. Behind him crouched a girl, June, about 4, fingers inside mittens too thin to offer warmth. A little boy named Tommy, about 3, clung to her coat sleeve. And the smallest, a toddler they called Annie, sat half-wrapped in a ragged swaddling cloth that did little to hold out the cold. Their small faces were pale, eyes wide, bodies trembling, yet they kept hunting hungrily among the scraps. A ranch hand, heavy-lidded and rough-jawed, approached them with a scowl. "Scatter, kids," he growled. "This ain't for stray pack rats." He raised a hand as if to scare them off. For a moment, silence held, cold and brittle. Then Eli's voice cracked the air. "Please do not take our food, we saved all day for this." His words stood stark in the wind. June's small bundle of stale bread crackled as she tried to lift it but dropped a crust to the snow. She bent quickly, fingers numb and shaking, scooping it up. She raised her head, looking at the man. "Mama says eat slow, so we will not be hungry later." Tommy's lips quivered in a small whisper toward Eli. "Can we bring some back for Mama?" "We will share," Eli answered softly. "Mama eats first. Mama skipped her breakfast this morning." The baby Annie shivered. In a voice raw and thin she murmured, "Bread, warm." Her little lips parted as though tasting hope. Silas stood motionless watching them. His breath came slow and even, misting in the bitter air. His eyes did not soften, yet his hand closed around the reins with quiet firmness. He did not shout. He did not move. Then he turned and walked into the mess hall without a word. The cook looked up, spat his rag onto the table, wiped his hands on his apron. "What is it, Mr. Morgan?" he asked, peering at him under flickering lantern light. "One portion," Silas said. His voice was calm, low, carrying no anger nor charity. "For someone outside, no name, no question." The cook hesitated only a moment, then set to work. He ladled beans into a tin pan, wrapped coarse cornbread in cloth, added 2 boiled potatoes and a hunk of salted ham. He tucked in a slice of apple and tied the parcel with twine. Silas accepted the warm parcel, his gloved hands cracking slightly as he folded the cloth over slow and careful. He stepped out into the snow again, the wind still gusting, the children still there, eyes wide, bodies coiled with need. He approached slowly, each boot imprint sinking deep into the white. He stopped a few feet from them. He crouched, set the parcel against the base of a hardy pine tree whose boughs offered scant shelter from the gale. He did not look at any of them. He did not speak. Eli stepped forward, uncertain, his lips parted as though to speak thanks. The others shifted closer, hope lighting their frozen faces. Silas rose, turned his back on them, and walked away. He mounted his horse without looking back, his boots pressed deep in the snow, leaving a heavy print near the tree. Then hoofbeats, echoing across white plains, fading until all that remained was the wind. Beneath the pine, the tin parcel sat out of the wind. Inside it, warmth and food. Inside it, a fragile promise that maybe this night, at least, hunger would not be so sharp. The wind had calmed, but the cold had not. Snow fell in quiet sheets across the ranchland, blurring the outline of the abandoned horse barn behind Morgan Ranch. Inside a makeshift tent stitched from burlap and old feed sacks, Miriam sat curled beside a flickering fire made from bark scraps and bits of straw, her arms wrapped around a rusted tin pot resting on her knees. Inside, 3 small potatoes sat half-cooked, their skins blistering in the heat. The fire barely warmed her fingers, let alone the space around her. Her 4 children lay tangled beside her, in a heap of fabric barely worthy of the word blanket. Their faces were smudged with ash and dust. The youngest, Annie, whimpered softly in her sleep. Eli, her oldest at 5, sat closest to the fire. He reached toward the pot, then stopped, his small hand hovering in hesitation. "Mama," he whispered, "we used to have a bigger pot, didn't we?" Miriam didn't lift her eyes. She stirred the potatoes with a splintered twig. "Yes, baby, bigger than this. And Papa used to bring wood," Eli continued. "Lots of it." A pause. "Yes," she said, her voice dry as wind. "He did." The silence that followed was thick. June stirred next, blinking up at her mother with sleepy eyes. "Mama, if tomorrow's not cold, will you smile again?" Miriam forced a breath through her nose and reached to adjust the blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "Maybe," she murmured, "if tomorrow is kind." Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Can we save some for Papa?" he asked. Eli turned and touched his brother's hand gently. "He's with the stars now, remember?" Tommy nodded. "But stars don't eat." "No," Eli said. "They shine." The fire crackled weakly. Outside, boots pressed snow, heavy, measured, drawing near. Miriam froze. She turned her head, body tense, shielding the children with one arm. Then she saw him. A silhouette standing just beyond the entrance of their lean-to, framed by the pale moonlight on snow. Silas Morgan. He did not speak. In his hands, a wooden box. He stepped forward only enough to place the box carefully on the ground, then straightened. His eyes flickered toward the fire, toward Miriam, and then away, as if staring too long might undo something fragile inside him. Then he turned and walked back into the dark, his footsteps muffled by snow. Miriam hesitated, then crawled toward the box. She opened it with cautious fingers. Inside, still warm, lay slices of cornbread, salted beans, a sliver of smoked ham, and a single red apple. Tucked into the corner, barely visible, was a pair of children's wool mittens, faded but whole. She held them in her hands, and for a moment the world felt still. "Mama," Eli whispered, "who brought it?" Miriam looked toward the dark where Silas had disappeared. "A good man," she said quietly. "I'll eat slow," June said, "so we can keep the warm longer." Miriam nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She pulled the mittens over Eli's raw, red hands. They were a snug fit. She said no prayer, just placed a hand on her son's head, and whispered, more to herself than him, "We have nothing left to give. but we will never forget kindness." Behind her, the fire gave a single, bright pop, like the heart of something frozen starting to beat again. Since that cold night, something had shifted. The children no longer feared the man in the heavy coat, who never spoke. They had given him a name, whispered between themselves like a secret spell. The Quiet Uncle. "Uncle Quiet is watching again," June would say, peeking from behind a frost-covered beam. "He walks like he is part of the wind," Eli added once, eyes wide with admiration. Silas never approached them directly. But each evening something would appear by the barn door, a bundle of chopped wood, a loaf wrapped in cloth, sometimes a single apple with the blemishes carefully carved off. He never left a note, never stayed to see it taken. But Eli noticed. And Eli, at 5, decided he had something to give back. With a broken piece of charcoal and scraps of brown wrapping paper he scavenged from behind the cookhouse, Eli began to draw. The first was a lopsided horse. The second, a crooked house, with a chimney blowing smoke like a cloud. Then came the sun, too big for the page, with lines like sunbeams reaching the corners. Each morning, before the others woke, Eli would tiptoe barefoot to the corner post near where Silas usually stood watching the land, and press his artwork between two stones. He never saw the man take them, but they disappeared by noon. One morning, Silas rode along the east fence line, checking the wire. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he dismounted to fix a broken rail. That was when he saw it. A small sheet of paper fluttered in the wind, pinned under a stone. He reached for it. The drawing was simple, a stick figure with a big hat and a square jaw, standing between 4 smaller figures. A line of smoke curled from a house in the background. And scrawled across the bottom in crooked letters, "You are a good man. Mama says so." Silas did not move for a long time. His breath fogged in the winter air. A crow cawed somewhere far off. He read the words again. Then he folded the paper with careful fingers and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket where a long-forgotten letter still lived. A letter he had written a decade ago, but never mailed. To a woman who had left before she ever arrived. He did not revisit that memory, only closed his coat tighter and kept writing. That night, instead of food, he left a woolen scarf by the barn door. The next night, it was a small sack of potatoes, then a roll of coarse cotton fabric and a tin of dried herbs. Miriam said nothing when she found them, but she touched each item like it was made of glass. The children, on the other hand, began calling the little corner where the gifts appeared, the magic spot. "Do you think Uncle Quiet is magic?" Tommy asked one night. "No," Eli said confidently. "He is just someone who does not know how to talk, so he gives instead." The days passed, and the snow kept falling. Then came the day Silas stood looking at the old horse barn, the wood sagging under its own weight. He studied the beams, the broken shingles, the patchwork tarp fluttering in the wind. He turned and rode into town. By noon, an old carpenter named Clyde, who had once built the Morgan stables, was standing beside him. "New barn?" Clyde asked. "No," Silas said. "Rebuild this one." "For livestock?" Silas hesitated, then said, "For people," quietly. Clyde looked at him, eyebrows raised. But he nodded. Understood. For the next week, Silas supervised every board placed, every nail driven into rotted wood. He said little, as always. But when asked what the place was for, he simply replied, "Someone cold." And nothing more. The wind howled that night, louder than it had in weeks. It clawed against the windows of the ranch house like a restless ghost, moaning through the eaves and whistling down the stone chimney. Silas Morgan could not sleep. He sat in the dark study, one boot propped on the edge of the fireplace, grate, watching the flames lean and twist. He held a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid trembling with every gust, rattling the shutters. Eventually, he stood. The hallway creaked under his weight as he walked to the far end of the house, where a narrow door led down to the cellar, a place he had not visited in years. He carried a lantern. The cellar was lined with wooden crates and dust-covered trunks. In the corner, half buried under old tarps and an unused saddle, was a cast-iron safe. Its hinges were stiff with disuse. Silas knelt, wiped the dial clean with his sleeve, and spun the combination from memory. Click. Inside, the contents were sparse: a leather pouch of silver coins, a deed, and a neatly folded white cloth, the corner embroidered with tiny, deliberate stitches, E and S. He lifted the cloth gently, as if it might disintegrate. Wrapped inside was a gold ring, plain, sturdy, made to last. And beneath it, a single page, yellowed slightly, but the handwriting still sharp, elegant, cold. He read it again, though he knew every word. You thought I loved you. I needed a way out of poverty. You were kind, but not enough. Not to stay, Esther. 7 years. He had not touched this safe since the week she left. She had vanished with the wagon and 2 of the best horses, and nearly every cent in their shared account, the one he had foolishly placed in both names after filing the deed transfer for her father's failing ranch. He had told no one. The townsfolk assumed Esther had taken ill or gone east to help family. Silas had never corrected them. He buried her name deeper than any grave, locking it in iron and silence. He had not loved another since, had not trusted, had not needed, until a boy's voice broke through snow and wind. Please don't take our food. We saved all day for this. Silas placed the letter back into the safe, folded with the same care he had shown the first time. The ring followed, placed exactly where it had rested for years. Then he reached for something else. Behind the ledger books and old tools was a small oiled parcel wrapped in brown cloth. Inside it lay a coat, soft wool, deep navy, with a velvet lining and reinforced cuffs. He had bought it the week before their planned wedding. Still attached to the collar was a stitched phrase in his own handwriting, embroidered by a shopkeeper's daughter at his request. For the keeper of fire, no title needed. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, he took the coat upstairs, shrugged on his old overcoat, and stepped out into the wind. The snow had begun again. At the back of the ranch, behind the stables, he reached the weathered barn where Miriam and her children slept. Light from within flickered faintly, their fire barely holding. He did not knock. He walked to the door, unlatched it slowly, and hung the coat on the hook just inside, careful not to make a sound. Then he turned and disappeared into the snow. In the morning, Miriam found it. At first, she thought it had been left by mistake, but then she saw the stitching. She pressed her hand to the words, running her fingers over the thread like it held warmth. She said nothing to the children. Only looked toward the main ranch house across the field, snow catching in her lashes, eyes filled with something she had not felt in a long, long time, not hope, not gratitude. Something quieter, deeper. Recognition. By the end of the week, the town was talking. Whispers slithered from the mercantile to the pews of the old chapel. Words sharpened like knives in mouths too bored or bitter to stay silent. She moved in on him, that widow, with those kids. They say he gave her a whole barn, wood and all. Men like Silas do not give anything unless they're getting something. A rock struck the side of the makeshift shelter behind the Morgan ranch. Miriam flinched, her body tensing over Annie, who had just begun to doze. Another voice rang out from the dark. Tricks do not buy bread here, girl. Earn your way like the rest of us." She said nothing. She never did. She only held her children closer and waited for silence. The next morning, Silas rode to the edge of town to check on the grain delivery. Carl, one of his older managers, ambitious, loud, rode beside him. Carl cleared his throat. "Sir, we need to talk." Silas kept his eyes on the hills. Carl continued, "There's talk about the widow. It's turning bad. Men at the saloon say she's ruining the Morgan name." Silas did not respond. Carl tried again, more forcefully. "With respect, sir, ranches fall not from drought or wolves, but from scandal. You let this go on, and you'll be known as the man who traded his good name for charity." Silas reined in his horse, turned to Carl slowly. "Do you know what is worth more than land?" he asked, voice calm but hard. Carl hesitated. "Sir?" Silas's jaw tightened. "A kind word. When someone has nothing left." Carl fell silent. That Sunday morning, the church bell rang clear over the frozen fields. As usual, the townspeople filled the narrow wooden pews, dusting snow from their coats, nodding politely but watching everything. The door creaked open midway through the hymn. Silas Morgan entered, tall and unmistakable in his black wool coat, and behind him 4 children. Eli held Silas's hand, the other children clutching their coats nervously. Behind them, Miriam paused in the doorway, unsure. Eyes turned, mouths fell silent. Miriam looked ready to bolt. But Silas stepped back, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He leaned in, voice low. "If you walk away now, they will think no one is worth protecting." Miriam blinked hard, then nodded once. Together, they walked down the center aisle. No one moved, no one breathed. They took a pew near the front. After the sermon, as the congregation began to stir, Silas stood before the pulpit. The preacher, old Reverend Hale, looked up in surprise as Silas removed his hat and addressed the room. "I am here to make one thing clear." His voice echoed. "These children and their mother live under my protection, my land, my roof, not as charity, but because I choose to stand where I believe it is right to stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas met every gaze. "If any man here thinks less of me for that, he is welcome to walk his boots across my fields and tell me to my face." Silence. Then, slowly, Reverend Hale stepped forward. He placed a hand on Silas's arm and said simply, "Amen." That was all. But when Miriam stepped out into the cold after the service, no rocks followed her, no names, no threats. Only space. Quiet space. Some looked away. Some nodded, hesitantly. Others still judged, but no longer out loud. From that day on, no one dared call her a guest. The fire started just after midnight. A hiss, a crack, then the sharp, unmistakable roar of flames eating wood. The wind, cruel and hungry, fed it like a god craving chaos. Miriam woke to June's scream. "Mommy, it is hot, Mommy." The children scrambled in the dark, coughing, eyes wide with smoke. The old door of the stone shelter glowed orange, its frame licked by fire. Miriam grabbed Annie, her heart thundering, and reached for the latch. But the handle was searing. She yelped, snatched her hand back, and shouted, "Stay close to me, get low." Tommy coughed violently. Eli tried to pull June beneath the wool blankets. The smoke thickened. The children cried, but it was Miriam's silence, her helpless, gasping silence, that tore the night. Then, a sound. Boots pounding. A crash. Through the heat-blurred haze, the door burst inward. A figure wrapped in a soaked blanket slammed against the wood, once, twice, until it gave way with a scream of splinters. It was Silas. He moved like a shadow through flame, scooping up Annie and Tommy first, thrusting them into the cold air outside, where a ranch hand had just arrived, blinking in horror. He went back in. The second time, he staggered slightly. A timber fell, smashing across his shoulder. He barely grunted, lifted it off, and found Eli curled near the hearth. "I've got you," Silas said hoarsely. Eli clung to him. Then June. Then Miriam. She would not leave. "You're bleeding," she sobbed. "You are hurt, your back." Silas pressed her hand into his coat, where warmth spread like spilled ink. "If I die," he whispered, his breath shallow, "teach them. Men must keep their word." Then he pushed her out ahead of him. The ranch hands beat at the flames with wet cloths, but the structure was lost. By the time dawn cracked open the sky, only blackened stones and curling smoke remained. Silas lay on a stretcher made from saddle blankets. His shirt was soaked in blood, eyes fluttering with fever and pain. Miriam held his hand, whispering prayers she had not used in years. Not far away, Eli stood beside a massive oak, the old tree that marked the edge of Morgan land. His hands were covered in soot. He used a charred stick to write across the wide trunk, the letters shaky but determined. "This place burned, but we stayed." No one stopped him. By morning, word had spread. One by one, people came. From the chapel, from the mill, from houses and barns across the valley. They came to see the ashes, yes, but they stayed for the silence that surrounded the man who once kept to shadows. There he sat, Silas Morgan, on a crate of salvaged wood. His back was wrapped, his face pale, but in his arms he held Annie, asleep against his chest. He said nothing. But he did not need to. Not when the children sat at his feet. Not when Miriam knelt beside him, eyes steady, shoulders no longer trembling. Not when the oak tree stood behind them all, bearing the words of a 5-year-old boy who had once feared losing crumbs of bread. Some looked on in awe, some in shame, but none, not a single soul, called Silas the silent man again. The wind howled against the wooden frame of the ranch house. It had not stopped since nightfall, dragging dry leaves across the porch like old regrets, brittle, restless, refusing to settle. The cold crept in through the cracks, no matter how tightly the windows were drawn. Inside, the fire burned low. Miriam sat on the edge of Silas's bed, her knees close together, her back straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Her hands were careful, steady. She peeled back the old bandage from his shoulder, bloodied linen sticking slightly to skin, and stitched flesh underneath. It came away slowly, revealing angry bruises, and raw threads tugged taut. Silas did not flinch, but his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking near his temple. "I will be gentle," she said, her voice quiet but sure, the way a woman speaks when she is trying not to wake her own pain. Silas said nothing. His eyes remained on the ceiling, unmoving. Not really looking, just holding on. Somewhere far beyond the beams, beyond the roof, beyond even the sky, his mind wandered where his body could not. Miriam pressed a warm cloth to the wound, cleaning away dried blood. Still silence. Then, a long moment later, his voice emerged, rough, dry, as if it had scraped its way out of a locked room. "I bought a ring once." She froze. Her hands paused against his skin, her breath catching just slightly, but she did not look up. She waited. 7 years ago, for Esther. He exhaled slowly, as if the words were heavier than the air itself. "I thought." She looked at me like I was more than a ranch, More than land and fences and cattle count. I was going to give her everything. House, title, my name on hers. I told myself I was finally needed. Miriam still said nothing. Her silence was not distance, it was space, a gift. She left, took what I had tucked away for the new land contract, left a note in the safe, said she never loved me, said she just wanted to escape being poor. His voice cracked then, barely. I did not love her for long after, but I hated myself for much longer. Miriam dipped clean linen into warm water, then wrung it out and began re-wrapping the wound. Her movements were gentle, but firm, the way a woman learns to be when everything soft inside her has once been used against her. "You do not need to be needed, Silas," she said quietly. He blinked, turned his head slightly, as if her words had drawn him back from some cliff's edge. "You only need to be seen," she continued. "And you are. Every time I look at you, I see the strongest man I have ever known." The fire popped in the hearth. Sparks rose and fell like silent punctuation. He did not respond at first, but his breathing changed. Slower, calmer, as if something in him had stopped bracing. Outside, the wind paused, briefly, like the world itself was listening. Then, without looking at her, Silas turned his hand, palm up on the quilt. Miriam looked down. Her hand hovered in the air. And then she placed it in his. His fingers were cold and rough, trembling not from pain, but from something far older. They sat like that for a long time. No more words. Just skin to skin, breath to breath, proof that neither was entirely alone. Then, in the hush between wind gusts, Silas whispered, voice thin but true, "If you are still here come morning, then this is not a ranch anymore." He looked at her fully now, eyes dark and bare. "It is a home." Spring rolled in like a soft sigh across the valley. The last frost melted into streams, grass returned to the hills, and birds began nesting under the eaves of the barns. Silas Morgan had never noticed how the air smelled different when the snow was gone. Lighter, almost forgiving. By the lake behind the main ranch, where the water caught the light just right at dusk, he built a small house. Pine walls, stone chimney, wide porch, not grand, not meant to impress. But warm, the kind that smelled like firewood and fresh bread before it was ever lit. He never said it was for them, but Miriam and the children moved in. No one asked, no paper was signed, no agreement made. It was simply understood, the kind of understanding that grows only from smoke and silence and survival. They cooked over the hearth. Eli helped sweep the porch. June picked wildflowers and stuck them in every jar. Tommy named the chickens. Annie laughed more. One afternoon, Eli ran into the barn, his cheeks pink with sun, his hands clutching a piece of wood. He held it out to Silas with both hands. "I made this," he said proudly. Silas took it. It was just a scrap plank, uneven and smudged with ash, but carved with care were the words, crooked but clear, "This is our forever man." For the first time in more years than he could count, Silas laughed. Not a quiet chuckle, but a real, startled, belly-deep laugh that echoed off the barn walls and made Annie jump with delight. That night, when the house had gone quiet, Silas went to the old storage room. It smelled like cedar and old memories. He opened the trunk he had not touched since the winter Esther left. Inside, still wrapped in cloth, was the sign he had once commissioned. Morgan Estate, carved deep, meant to hang over the porch of a life that never came to be. Silas flipped it over. The back was smooth, untouched. He took his carving knife, the same one his father gave him, and began again. Letter by letter, word by word. It took hours. But by dawn, He held something new in his hands. Morgan family, not for sale. He carried it down to the house by the lake. Miriam was at the stove, stirring oats. The children were chasing each other on the grass. Silas said nothing. He simply hung the sign by the door, above the frame. Not high, not hidden. Just enough for every visitor, and every doubt, to see. That evening, as the sun poured amber light through the windows, Miriam stood at the threshold. She held Annie on her hip. Eli clutched a book. Tommy and June whispered about soup. Silas stood inside. He did not open the door. He had already opened it hours ago, and left it that way. "Are we early?" Miriam teased. He shook his head. "No, just in time." She stepped in first. The children followed, trailing shadows and laughter. And Silas said, for the first time in his life, not to land, not to contracts or cattle or banks, but to people. To the ones he had built this for. Welcome home. If the story of Silas Morgan and that little family tugged at your heart, remember this: in the Wild West, it was not just about guns and outlaws. It was about quiet hands reaching out in the cold, doors left open without being asked, and hearts that dared to believe in kindness again, even after they had been broken. If you felt the weight of unspoken love, the strength of sacrifice, and the beauty of a home built not by blood but by choice, hit that hype button to keep these stories alive. And subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of devotion, redemption, and the kind of love that rises from dust, fire, and silence. Because here, we tell the love stories history forgot, but your heart never will.